Hey everybody, it's Peter. This is a video that I've been excited to do for a long time, and it actually comes from the comment section where you guys asked me to compare the Kawasaki Z650RS with the Kawasaki Z900RS. So in this video, we're going to go through the details of each bike, talk about what they are individually, and compare them to each other. And at the very end, I'm going to sort of share a little surprise, so stick around for that. Let's go. So before we go too far, I want to thank Jim Gilbert's Wheels and Deals, Jim Gilbert's Power Sports, for giving me access to these bikes. And the best part is they give me access to these bikes anytime I want. So if you have questions that I don't get to in this video or some of the other videos I've done on these bikes, make sure you let me know in the comments below, because I can come back to these bikes and make sure that I get your answer both in the comment section and in future videos. So hit the subscribe if you want to know more about these bikes, and let me know in the comment section what it is you want to know more about. Now, before we go too far, we should talk about really briefly the history. And the history of these bikes starts back in the 1970s when Kawasaki introduced a bike that looked a lot like this. It was the Kawasaki Z1. I'll do a future history video on these so that we can talk about them in detail, but briefly, the Z1 introduced super sport bikes to the world, and it basically competed with the Honda CB750, which was the four-cylinder bike that Honda came out with. And because Honda came out with that, they sat back on this, gave it a great engine, and a lot of things happened between when the Honda was introduced and the Kawasaki to make this really the standout of its time. Then a few years later, they came out with a Z650, which looked a lot like this. And now we fast forward 50 years, and you have these two bikes right here, which are styled to look like the previous bikes, but are very modern bikes down low. So let's start with the 650, talk about what that is, move on to the 900. And the 900, I should point out, is the SE model. So this is the top spec version. There's a few extra things on this that you won't get on every 900RS, but we'll show you them as well. And then we'll go back and forth to make sure that you see every detail that you can to know which one's best for you. So starting with the Z650RS, we should talk about the engine first, because it's an engine they use in just about everything, from the Versys to the Vulcan to the regular Z650 to the Z650RS. The RS stands for Retro Sport, and that's really what this is. Now, this particular one is the 50th anniversary edition. It has a few extra details like the gold wheels and this extra bar here, a little bit of details on the paint here as well that say 50th anniversary edition. But basically, this is, in my opinion, one of the best 650 bikes that Kawasaki sells, because it's super versatile in what it does. It's relatively sporty, it's quite comfortable, it gives you some great styling that looks way better in person, and it's very, very practical. So let's take a look at some of those practical details to start. So when we talk practicality, the first thing we should really talk about is right here, a big, comfortable seat. Both of these bikes have very comfortable seats, which is pretty rare in the sporty side of motorcycling, and these bikes are still relatively sporty. But in addition to being comfortable for you, it's large enough for a passenger, and again, rear seats on the 650 bikes, especially something with a little sporting capability, usually not this large as well. And then, of course, on the 50th anniversary edition, this extra bar here gives you the ability to have passenger grab rail, an extra way to hold on. There's lots of things, or an extra place to tie a luggage down as well. And there's a lot of things you can sort of gain from having that there. Now, if we talk about tying luggage on, below the passenger foot peg here, which on this bike are rubber foot pegs on the rear. On the 900, they're actually no rubber coating on the rear, but you do have this extra panel behind here as well, and that allows you to have a tie down right here for tying things on to the back of the bike. So you have the ability to do weekend trips with this by putting extra luggage on the rear seat, or you can take a second passenger, whatever suits your needs. Another practical piece of this bike is the overall switchgear and control. So this is a slipper and assist clutch. Now, if you've driven an older bike, you'll find that the clutch is quite heavy. The slipper and assist, the assist portion makes for a lighter clutch pull, and the slipper clutch allows you to have better control, which we'll talk about that in a second. But you see here some modern pieces. You have 5 different adjustments to have the reach adjustment here. So whether you have smaller hands or larger hands, you can adjust this in or out with this little dial on the fly. Just stop for a second, spin the knob, and it comes in or out. And that allows you to have extra control here with the clutch lever and the brake lever. On both levers here, they're both adjustable. Then you have some modern controls here. There's a flash to pass over here, and we'll come around in a second to show you the other controls here, but fully modern controls instead of the retro style to go along with the retro style bike. So staying with the Z650RS, they have different gauges here, and you have the true dial style gauges. Now what's interesting is both this and the 900 both have speedometers that go to 240 kilometers an hour, but they're different fonts. So this one has that sort of teal color in there that they used to do in the retro bikes. What you'll see is very similar on both, and we'll show you the 900 as well when we get there, is this center display screen. So the dials I actually love. When we sit there and look at screens today, we find that we tend to gather all kinds of information on them. We basically stare at them, but the dials back in the day, you used to know if your needle was pointing in a certain direction, I'm going approximately 120, approximately 60, approximately 80, and same thing with your tack lever. You would know, or tack here, you would know exactly where you are in the rev range at a quick glance. So dials are super easy to read. There's no higher resolution in a screen than actual dials like this. It works really, really well. And then you still have the modern touches of all the things you would want on a modern bike. So there's some switch gear here we'll show you in a second. If you look at the very bottom there, it's at the odometer right now. You can switch to trip A, to trip B, to kilometers per liter. Now I'm pretty sure you can do liters per 100 kilometers. I just haven't checked the manual on how to switch it, but I'm almost positive you can do that as well. There's the average kilometers per liter. Again, we can do liters per 100 kilometers. And then there's the range to empty and back to your odometer. So you have temperature gauge, a neutral, which is the gear indicator, as well as the neutral light, the clock in there. So all the things you want on a modern bike are right there. But then again, that classic look overall, and when you turn the bike off, it kind of like blanks out and it looks like just the gauges here. So pretty cool gauge cluster here. And again, the Z900RS is a little different. We'll show you that when we get there. Moving to the left side controls, you've got that flash to pass over here on the trigger. We showed you that before. And then you've got the lock the high beams on, low beams. These are LED headlights on both these bikes. Signals, horn, four-way flashers or hazard lights. And then you have this controller here. This is what I was using to cycle through that trip computer that I just showed you. It is a little different on the Z900, so we'll show you that. But again, similar controls here, just a little different control on the Z900, which like I said, we'll get to in a second. So now let's talk about seating position before we go over some of the mechanical pieces of this bike. One thing you're going to notice is a lot of bikes have a really high tail here. This one doesn't, sort of levels off here, which means swinging your leg over is much easier. And of course, this has a fairly low seat height, kind of a mid-level seat height. I'm about 6 feet tall. I think it's a 32-inch inseam or so, but you can see I'm very comfortable here, flat-footing both sides, and I can actually flat-foot both these bikes quite easily. So a lot of tanks here are sculpted. With the retro design, it's not, and that always made me wonder, is it comfortable to sit here? And it absolutely is. You've got a nice sort of comfortable area to put your legs against there. It's not like too wide or anything else. And then the overall riding position, as you can see, is a very square, comfortable riding position. Now, slight forward lean, which is nice with no wind protection, but there's no real weight on your hands. Now, when I talk about no wind protection, because this is a handlebar and a headlight, there are all kinds of windscreens that will fit on this bike, both from Kawasaki and in aftermarket world, and that allows you to have wind protection if you want, and that to me is the biggest thing with this bike. You can strap luggage on, you can get your wind protection if you want it, but if you don't want it, you've got this classic look, wind across your body, very, very comfortable. This bike is one of those bikes that would be great for a new rider to figure out what kind of motorcycling they like. If they want the classic looks but don't necessarily want a cruiser, maybe want something that handles a little better, this is that. If they want something that's comfortable, this is that. If they want something that's sporty, this also is that. And you may want to move on to this to either one of those directions or any one of those directions. If you want to move on and stay in the same engine with more touring capability, the Versus has the big windshield and the bags that come with it. If you want to stay and go to a cruiser, you can move with the same engine to the Vulcan S. And of course, the Ninja and the regular Z line allow you some sportiness as well. So pretty cool sort of overall features here with comfort and practicality that really allow you to do just about anything you want on a bike like this. But let's look at the mechanicals before we go too far. So when we talk about this engine, I should mention in several videos I've talked about it being the perfect engine for street use. And you've got this 650 twin cylinder, approximately 67, 69 horsepower, in the mid to high 60s. There's no rating in North America for these engines, but that's sort of the general assumption is from other tests and other areas of the world where they do rate these for horsepower. So in that high 60s, they don't really talk about tuning this different than any of the other bikes. It's a fairly lightweight bike. I think it's about 417 pounds or so, which means that you have a good power to weight ratio with this engine. Now, one of the things with this engine combination is most of the bikes that have it have an exhaust that finishes up underneath here. You've got that sort of catalytic converter underneath there, and the exhaust stops short of the rear wheel. What I like about that is it gives you that kind of cool look to the unique swing arm there. That's pretty cool. Single disc in the back. You've got front dual discs over here, ventilated. Traditional type Nissan calipers there. Or Nissan, yeah, calipers and discs here. And again, the dual disc available here with ABS. So you've got ABS brakes front and rear, rubber lines here, which is what you would get on pretty much anything in the class, and the right side up suspension. We'll talk about the upside down suspension on the 900, but overall, very classic look, a good fit to all of the mechanicals, and a really versatile bike without getting too expensive. So now moving on to the Z900RS, this one being the SE edition. Even though that bike was really derived from this one, I like to talk about this one second because this one is everything that that bike is, except it adds more. So the one thing I forgot to mention is the horizontal back link rear suspension, which both these bikes share. So this one, we're going to talk about the adjustments on this one in a second, but the old bikes used to have the sort of suspension up here. Now some people say to get that retro look you need the suspension down here, but the reason you have this horizontal backlink suspension is the exact same style of suspension that they put in their Ninja sport bikes and even race bikes, and that allows the weight to be moved centrally, centered in the chassis and forward, which helps you with the handling. So when you're riding either one of these bikes, they handle like a modern sport bike, and that's what makes them a lot of fun. So moving on to this bike, let's talk about some of the things that make this bike a little bit unique and some of the things that it adds to the 650. So the seating concept is exactly the same on the 900 versus the 600, but this one does step it up as far as the trim. You have these nice sort of ribs across. It just looks like a nicer seat. The functional difference is this appears to be a little bit larger on the 900. Now I guess the 900cc bikes, maybe you'll take more of a passenger or take passengers more often on this bike, so maybe it's a little bit larger for that reason, but it's worth mentioning that it does seem to be a little bit longer than it was on the 650. Now we talk about luggage, we had that extra bar across here on the 50th anniversary edition of the 650. You can get that here as an accessory. I think I might do that. On this bike though, you do have a little nub down here to tie down instead of on the foot peg area, and you also have a little hook in here. So you can still take luggage on the back seat of this bike, which makes this bike also fully capable of doing those weekend tours. The 900RS steps it up in the details as well, and this is one of those weird things that I've never been able to find any information on, but I'm going to show you the same exact controls on the Z650RS right now. So what you're looking at on your camera right now is the kill switch and the start switch for the Z650RS, and that is the same kill switch and start switch as you have on just about everything in Kawasaki's lineup. Now we're back to the Z900RS, and I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but this is a different kind of red and a little different style switch and a different kind of gray. They look sunshine faded. They look like they've been out weathered and that kind of thing, and it gives it that kind of old bike look, which again, I don't know if they got that for this bike, but it really feels like it's just sort of weathered and older on this bike, which is just an example of some of the little details that they focused on when they wanted to get this bike right. Taking a look at the gauges here now, I should mention that these are really a lot more visible outside. In the studio light here, there's a little bit more reflection, but you can see, again, both bikes go to 240 kilometers an hour. This one's a little cleaner, a little more crisp, and just no extra details, none of that sort of extra lines in there. Now, as we turn it on, you'll see a very similar look to what we just saw. Basically, this seems to be the exact same to me as we go through the selections here. Again, oops, we'll go right here. Trip A, trip B, you've got kilometers per liter, which again can be liters per 100 kilometers, the average of those, and then you've got the range to empty, and the outside temperature, which I don't remember if the other bike had that or not, and then the odometer. So we do have the outside temperature. I think that's unique to this bike. Fuel range, fuel capacity, fuel fill there. Temperature gauge on the other side. There is one other extra thing up here, and it's the KTRC, Kawasaki Traction Control. There are 3 settings for that. The default is level 1, you also have level 2, and then you have off. So a lot of people would use level 2 in the rain, some people would use it all the time. Level 1 is the default, and again, turning it off if you were going to the track or if you just don't want any intervention at all. So you do have traction control, and again, with this more powerful engine, that makes some sense as well. But pretty simple stuff, pretty basic stuff here, so you really have that retro feel. So taking a look at the controls on the left side handlebar, it's basically the exact same as the 600, but you do have this new selection switch in there. The only difference there is that traction control. Everything else works the same way, but that traction control can be selected with that extra switch there. We talked about the brake lever and the clutch lever on the other bike, and these ones are also adjustable in the exact same way, so there's no real difference there. So before we go into the mechanicals on this, and there are some key differences that you may want to know if you're into the Z900RS versus, for instance, the Z900 and other bikes in the lineup, we'll talk about seating position again. Very similar thing, low rear end here, so it's easy to swing a leg over. It is a little bit taller on this bike. There is a little bit more weight. I think it's about an extra, well, the other one's 417. I think this one's 470 or so, 476 in that range for a wet weight. The tank is a little larger, but the seating position, again, still very good. Now the tank is wider in part because you have 4 cylinders across here that it's got to sit over top of instead of 2 cylinders. So you do feel like this is a slightly larger bike, but again, similar lean forward. You could put a windshield on if you wanted. You have plenty of room for your luggage. And again, same idea. Now this bike I wouldn't recommend as much for beginners, and that really comes down to the power in this bike. But this bike is an absolute blast to drive down a country road and on the roads. And there are some mechanical differences that make it great for an on-road sport bike. Let's talk about those right now. So every Z900RS has this engine, and it's shared with the Z900. However, this one makes less horsepower. Now, one of the things that people get concerned about is, oh, I don't want it to make less horsepower. The interesting thing about this bike, though, is really between 4,000 or maybe even 3,500 and around 8,000 RPM. In the mid-range, which is sort of the center of your tack, this bike actually makes more horsepower in those rev range than the Z900. So peak horsepower, when it's revved out to the very top, that peak number is higher on the Z900, but on this bike, it's higher in your usable range. So the 4,000 to call it 8,000-ish RPM range, you actually have more horsepower and more torque available to you than you would on the higher peak horsepower Z900. So it comes down to spec sheet horsepower or real world horsepower, and this one actually has the Z900 beat in most of your real world driving. Now if you're going to the racetrack and you're going to be using that top end, that 8,000 to 10,000 more RPM, that's where that Z900 is going to make a difference. But on the road, you actually do better for most of your riding with this one, which is an interesting piece. The other thing that's interesting is this has a sound-tuned exhaust and intake. So basically, rumors they went through like 20 different sort of settings to get the sound right. And part of a bike like this is getting that sound right, and a lot of people love the sound of this, me included. I think it's something that you wouldn't have to switch anything out to get the sound that you want. So mechanically, the engine and exhaust are pretty interesting. Let's talk about the suspension now, though. Compared to the Z650RS, you can right away notice that there are larger tubes in here on the 900 than you have on the 650. Now you may notice these ones are gold. This is part of that SE package. All of them have these upside down shocks. Upside down shocks give a little less weight or unsprung weight, which is what you want. A little extra stability here. They're basically what you want on a higher sporting bike. Now every Z900RS has this design. These ones are tuned a little bit different. In these gold color on the SE, they're tuned a little bit different than on the regular one. So again, good suspension on both. The real difference here, these are tuned to work with the rear shock, and the rear shock is different on this SE. It's a step up that I really appreciate. So the rear shock on this is special. Again, same mounting, that backlink rear suspension, same mounting up high. And again, on the regular 900RS, you just sort of have a black spring in there, and it's not as easily identifiable as this one with the yellow spring. That's because this is an Öhlins shock, or Öhlins, however you want to say it. I'm going to call it Öhlins. I probably am saying it wrong. So in this shock here, you have your preload adjuster here for full adjustability. That is specific to the SE model. And then of course the overall shock is the Öhlins shock as well, or Öhlins shock as well, which is a sort of race spec type shock. So this gives you a lot more control, a lot more customization, and it gives you a little bit better ride as well as better sporting potential. Now I should mention that this shock is fully adjustable, and on all of the Z900s, the front shock is fully adjustable as well, which the Z650RS does not have. So the SE model features that upgraded suspension, but it also has a big feature up front here with Brembo brakes. So first of all, if you're looking at the regular RS, you still have the dual caliper, both sides caliper front brakes, and they're ventilated. They look very similar, but these ones are Brembos. And Brembos, of course, give you that increased stopping power, just a higher end braking system. You also have the braided stainless steel lines, front and rear, so you don't have to do that upgrade afterwards to get a really high quality braking experience. So the second last thing we should talk about, and stick around for the last thing, the second last thing we should talk about is who are these bikes for? Well, first of all, this 650cc I think is great for people who want to use it on the street, want to have a really versatile bike that's really comfortable. It's pretty good value for what it is, and it may not look great on camera, but it looks fantastic in person. One thing I wasn't able to show you with the paint is when you're outside, the paint on this has a lot of sparkle to it. So it's a really, candied kind of paint that really stands out with a lot of metallic in there. These look super cool in person, and that's really what this does. It gives you a really practical, comfortable, usable, sporty riding bike without being too harsh or too focused like a track bike, and makes it a lot of fun. It's also a pretty good beginner bike if you're ready for that 650cc power, because I don't think it's something that you're going to want more speed out of or anything else. And again, you can kind of do everything. Moving over to this bike is a nice step up. This bike has all kinds of usable street power while giving you a lot more just overall features. This SE model really steps up with the Brembo brakes, the upgraded suspension, and really takes this into a very sporty vehicle that's also very comfortable and also very practical, and it looks super cool. Both of these paint schemes, again, have a lot of metallics in them, and they're both retro style, exact copies of the retro style bikes that used to be in this kind of color. So overall, which one's best for you? Well, that's for you to decide. One thing I will say, and this is sort of the hint, the secret that I was going to reveal, is if you like this bike, or really both these bikes, but especially if you like this bike, it's probably a really good time to subscribe to this channel, because I'm very quietly announcing right now that I just bought this bike, this exact one. And I'm gonna add a couple accessories on it, and we're gonna make it a long-term feature on this channel. So if something goes wrong, we'll tell you about it. They'll talk about things I like and don't like. We'll do some riding reviews. We'll do all kinds of things on this bike. Like I said, if you wanna know about the history, we're gonna talk about that. You wanna go touring on this bike, we plan that as well. So all kinds of things coming up on this one right here, and we'll do a proper video announcement right now. But if you've watched to the end of this video, you deserve to be let in early, that this one will be on the channel a whole lot. So if you want to see a bike like this in person, swing on down to Jim Gilbert's Wheels and Deals, because they have these in stock right now. This one you can't ride, and you probably shouldn't sit on, but it will still be around for a little while here because it's currently snowing, but they have a whole bunch more coming in as well. There's a massive inventory of bikes even here in January, so make sure you swing on by to them. And do me a favor, give us a like on the video to thank Jim Gilbert's Wheels and Deals for giving me full access to these bikes so that we can come back with more and more videos. Thanks everybody for watching.